This is certainly far from the era of, say, Louis XIV, who was able to make a declaration such as, "I am the state." There are no kings or potential queens that are able to make that claim because there are so many uncertainties. There's this crisis of succession. There's a papal schism in Rome. In a lot of ways, this book is a validation or a legitimization of authority. It seeks to validate power itself. So it's an appropriate book to look at in the context of state formation. And I think especially important to look at in the context of Rothbard's Anatomy of the State. By the end of this talk, you'll learn that I'm sort of two minds of this text, but we'll get into that later. So the goal of this paper is twofold. It's to demonstrate how Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State provides a useful theoretical lens through which to view literary myths and legends in Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain, and to demonstrate how even literary text can provide valuable political economic insights. These are ambitious goals, and in the time we have here, I can't come close to achieving them perfectly, of course. This paper will only skim the surface, but I hope that it'll raise some provocative issues that can later be explored in more depth and detail. Throughout the paper, I'm going to use the post-17th century understanding of the word state to apply to the nation that Geoffrey describes, in part because Rothbard uses the term state in Anatomy of the State, and in part because although nations may refer to something less geographically determined than states, I would like to emphasize that the state and the nation are similar organisms sprung from myths that can inspire the polis to consolidate rules and regulations on the basis of cultural solidarity. So for my purposes, I'll define state as Rothbard did in the essay, which is the state is an organization in society which attempts to maintain a monopoly of the use of force and violence in a given territorial area, and which is the only organization in society that obtains its revenue not by voluntary contribution or payment for services rendered, but by coercion. The history is a 12th century chronicle, as I've already explained, written by a Welsh cleric, and it offers evidence for Rothbard's claim that the state has never been created by social contract, but instead by conquest and exploration, that the ruling group, once it has established itself as the condition or agency necessary for the state's existence, must conduct a rhetorical and ideological campaign to validate the power it enjoys, and that the chief task of the rulers is always to secure the active or resigned acceptance of the majority of its citizens. The history tells a story about the lineage of kingship and government in Britain, and so tells the story of the rise of the British state. That's what Rothbard's Anatomy of the State does as well, except for it's just in the context of the state in general. Considering Geoffrey's text in light of Rothbard's is interesting, to say the least, because Geoffrey writes during a moment of crisis, when there is no one certain British sovereign. There's no king or queen, but they're in violent contests over the crown. Geoffrey can't risk this. What this means essentially is that Geoffrey can't risk glorifying one potential ruler over another, one contemporary potential ruler over another, since at any time that potential ruler could be defeated by his, or in the case of Matilda, her rival. Therefore, Geoffrey glorifies the state itself, and rather than celebrating any contemporary leader, he celebrates kingship in general as being a necessary and proper manifestation of the state, or perhaps as the proper state icon. The history would seem to promote liberty only to the extent that it suggests that kings are bound by a precedent of law and order that precedes their rule. I'm going to talk about that a little later. This is something that I was reconsidering before I decided I was coming to terms with Rothbard's view, and then I had sort of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty in the back of my mind, and of course Rothbard hated that book. So if I do sound as if I'm of two minds, it's because I've got these two texts rattling around in my head, and I'm trying to sort of reconcile them in this text. The book also seems to validate the power of the king and the state simply for the sake of glorifying power, going so far as to couch both the king and the state in religious and ecclesiastical terms. The history exalts the ideals of statehood and nationalism, and it suggests that the power and authority of the state are good and noble and divine. In 1100, Henry I had become king during a crisis of succession when he ratified a treaty with Robert, Duke of Normandy, and this is basically the history I explained earlier. His son passes away. Stephen of Blois gets the throne over Matilda, Henry's daughter. Stephen is Matilda's cousin. As Matilda challenges Stephen's claim to the throne, it precipitates civil war in Britain. And when Geoffrey completes the history, Matilda's son, Henry II, is 3 years old. In this chaotic age, the validity of any one sovereign is called into question. And so intellectuals like Geoffrey were inclined to glorify the concept of the state rather than any one person as the iconic representation of the state. Geoffrey therefore promotes sovereign authority generally by attending to tales about putative justice and rule of law while strategically avoiding references to contemporary sovereigns or kings. Henry II, people may remember, just to provide a little context, it's hard to say what he would have been most famous for, but there's sort of general agreement that the common law sprung up during his reign. He's famous for the great clash with St. Thomas of Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Insofar as kings and the state gain authority through images and symbolism, the history facilitates a semiotics of power. The story celebrates three strong, manly kings above all. Brutus, the invented father of the nation. Brutus is supposedly the great-grandson of the Trojan Aeneas. Belenus, who supposedly sacked Rome with his brother Brennius, and Arthur, who married the beautiful Guinevere, was portrayed by Mordred and oversaw legendary knights and conquered and subjugated many foreign peoples. So the history of the kings of Britain is, basically the original text from which we draw our Arthurian legends. So it's got Arthur, it's got Excalibur, it's got Guinevere, it's got Merlin. We've got the Knights of the Round Table. So this text is extremely important. It becomes extremely popular, not just in Britain but in the continent. It's written in Latin, and it sort of explodes. We actually still have versions of this text from the 12th century. These fictional men serve what Rothbard calls the classic paradigm of a conquering tribe pausing in its time-authored method of looting and murdering a conquered tribe to realize that the time span of plunder would be longer and more secure and the situation more pleasant if the conquered tribe were allowed to live and produce, with the conquerors settling among them as rulers exacting a steady annual tribute. Now, it's worth mentioning here, before I get too far into this, that Arthur is also known for waging a defensive war early in his career, but later he becomes more or less an imperialist, and he does fend off the Saxon invaders as a young man, but then he conquers and subjugates the rest of Britain, what hasn't been consolidated, also Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Gaul, and he tries to sack Rome before he returns back to try to reclaim his crown after Mordred has started having an affair with Guinevere and starts assuming kingship in Arthur's absence. So this is precisely what the rulers in the history do. After waging war, imposing rigid legal codes, and assimilating resistant yet conquered tribes, the supposedly great kings ensure the complete submission of their subjects, both foreign and domestic, not only by the use of force, but also by providing public goods that are meant to win ideological support. More than 1/5 of the history is devoted to King Arthur, who wins the support of the polis and validates the lust for power among those real potential monarchs living in Geoffrey's time. It's important to remember that the wealthy, the intellectuals, the clerics are all enamored by this book. If Arthur provides a quasi-religious justification for state power in the book, he also inspires and romanticizes state power in real life. It bears mentioning Rothbard's comments that rulers like to present the idea that they are given their authority by God. This is, after all, the sovereign whose birth is something of a magical conception enabled by the soothsayer Merlin, and whose death is never explicitly mentioned, for Arthur was described as having been merely carried away to the Isle of Avalon, where he awaits the moment when he will fulfill Merlin's prophecy by reappearing in history. That is, when he will enjoy something like a second coming. Geoffrey treats the body of the king as the site of law and the nucleus of the state. His first sustained treatment of law and the sovereign appears at the end of Brutus's section. Here, Geoffrey submits that when Brutus built his capital on the River Thames, Brutus not only presented the city to the citizens by right of inheritance, but also gave those citizens a code of laws. Wow, that's very fast. Geoffrey depicts the need for a centralized power secured by laws and regulations. The lack of a centralized authority or definite sovereign is why, according to the history, Britain falls into disarray when, after Brutus's death, Brutus's sons divide the kingdom into thirds. As a result of this partition, the brothers are unable to maintain the unified military presence necessary to preserve the polis and his laws, and thereby the island suffers from foreign invasion and bloodshed. The goal of this chapter, if I can read one into the chapter, is that laws and regulations enable the British kings to enhance their military power, and military power is necessary to defend and spread the national ideology. So this is what's going on in the text, and also how the text is functioning in its own culture. With 5 minutes left, I'll have to skip ahead quite a bit, unfortunately. The legend of kings and law shows how Geoffrey employed claims of antiquity as indirect appeals for the continued import of governmental supervision and state control in Britain. Part of the law's enforcement power had to do with its capacity to inspire adherents. Adherents are necessary to carry out the terms and conditions of the sovereign, who is the icon of the state. The state needs followers, not just enforcers, and the act of following has a self-policing mechanism built into it. The explanation for Geoffrey's frenzied insistence on lineage lies in his commitment to the supremacy of the state on the one hand, and to his strategy of hagiography on the other. So Geoffrey's tale is something of a secular theology with the sovereign as Godhead. The history invents a past for the state. It's important to point out that 90% of this is pure fiction, thus lending the state a textual foundation and a mythologized foundation. The message is that law in the 12th century has a legitimate origin and a guaranteed lineage, and is therefore of unquestioned force and unimpeachable quality. The better the law, the more expansive the state needs to be to protect and defend the law. That's sort of the logic. During Arthur's reign, laws and regulations begin to crystallize into something of a state with centralized power. A sovereign such as Arthur can issue commands that the polis ought to and will habitually obey. Establishing Arthur as a model king validates the notion of sovereignty and statehood, as well as the various commands that flow from sovereigns. And I use the word commands intentionally as in contradistinction to the term, to the common law idea of laws sort of springing out, working themselves out in sort of a ameliorative Darwinian way. Geoffrey of Monmouth was, as far as we know, an intellectual. Rothbard points out that it is evident the state needs the intellectuals. For a king to gain essential acceptance, Rothbard says, the majority must be persuaded by ideology that their government is good, wise, and at least inevitable, and certainly better than other conceivable alternatives. That is precisely what the history sets out to prove. Promoting this ideology among the people, Rothbard goes on to say, is the vital social task of the intellectuals, or of people like Geoffrey. For the masses of men, explains Rothbard, do not create their own ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and disseminated by the body of intellectuals. The intellectuals are, Rothbard concludes, therefore opinion molders in society. And since it is precisely a molding of opinion that the state most desperately needs, the basis for age-old alliance between the state and the intellectuals becomes clear. Now, this is a short paper, and I've had to skip over quite a bit. Thank you. But in a larger project, it might be worth considering the history with a little more scrutiny and nuance, because it is the way of the Marxist literary critic to treat literature as, purely the ideological function of some powerful group or another. And I hesitate to try to do that in a Rothbardian way, to treat the book as nothing but, some kind of ideological project. I don't like thinking of text as determined, and I like to think that good complex works of literature offer various interpretations, and this one possibly offers some interpretations that are conducive to liberty. For example, a horrible ruler like Vortigern, Merlin prophesies that he's going to have a horrible death, and he does. And so there are instances in the text where coercion becomes problematic. At any rate, yes, coercion is about to take place. At any rate, I do think this would be a great text to sort of look at through Rothbard's Anatomy of the State in contrast to Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, and just see how they're sort of competing interpretations through two great Austrian economic thinkers that we could sort of play out and compare, and say something not just about the text, but about the differences between these two Austrian thinkers. So thank you very much.